Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into a topic today that I think will resonate with pretty much everyone listening,
Yeah.
especially if you're, out there working, navigating the complexities of the modern workplace.
Yeah,
We
definitely.
talk about microaggressions.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people have heard this term,
Right.
but, maybe aren't exactly sure, how to define it.
Yeah, and even if you can define it, sometimes they're so subtle that it's hard to recognize them in real time, you know?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about them is that, even though we say microcuts,
Yeah.
they're small,
Right.
they can actually have a really significant impact.
Absolutely, like a death by 1,000 paper cuts, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we really want to kind of dig into today.
Yeah.
Is like, what is the impact of these things,
Mm-hmm.
both on individuals and also on organizations?
Yeah.
Because like you were saying, it's not just about, individual harm. It's also about creating this
Absolutely.
kind of toxic work environment that can really hurt the bottom line as well.
100%, 100%. And, we're basing a lot of our discussion today on this great article called Understanding Workplace Microaggressions, a guide to navigating subtle biases in the workplace.
Yes.
And one of the things they talk about is, just how pervasive these things are, how common they are.
Yes, and the examples that they gave in the article I think are really helpful.
Oh, definitely.
Because they highlight just how subtle some of these things can be.
Mm-hmm.
They're not always
Right.
like blatant,
Not overt, right?
overt discrimination. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's more these like little digs and these little like almost like backhanded compliments sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that undermining,
Yeah.
way of communicating with people.
And it can be really hard to even recognize.
Yeah.
Like in the moment
It's
sometimes.
actually in the moment because you're thinking like, wait, did they just say that? Or what did they mean by that?
Right. And you're kind of second guessing yourself.
Exactly. And then the other thing is sometimes you just kind of brush it off like, oh, I'm sure they didn't mean anything by that.
Yeah.
But then it kind of eats at you, later on.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like that feeling where you can't quite put your finger on it.
Right.
Like, something's off, but you don't know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what it is.
Exactly. And if it happens again and again, it kind of builds up,
Right.
So, let's look at some examples because I think that's really helpful
Yes.
to,
I'd love to hear some of the examples.
because when you see it in action, then you can kind of
What?
get a better feel for what we're talking about.
Yeah. And the article gives some really good ones.
Absolutely. So, for instance, something like,
Oh, yeah. Like,
if you have a coworker of color and somebody says, oh, wow, you speak English so well,
yeah.
on the surface,
Right.
it sounds like a compliment, right?
Right.
But
It's like
it implies
that you're surprised.
yes, that you shouldn't speak English well, you
Yeah.
know?
And it kind of reinforces this idea that
Yes.
they're an outsider or that
Exactly.
their English isn't their
First language or that they're not,
Right.
From here or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, so that's one example. And, there are so many others we can kind of dig into.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example because I think it highlights just how insidious these things can be because, like, it's not like
Yes.
somebody walked up and said something overtly racist.
Exactly. It's very subtle and it's very common.
Right.
I've heard that one myself.
Yeah.
And I've seen other people, kind of react to that in a way where you can tell that it's hurtful.
Yeah.
Even though the person who said it probably didn't,
Right.
mean it that way.
Right. Had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what makes it so tricky, right?
Exactly.
Because it's like,
And sometimes intent doesn't equal impact, right?
it's like,
So you can say, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way, but it doesn't really matter because the impact.
because how it landed.
Yes,
It's really what matters.
Absolutely.
So what are some other, common examples?
Well, another one is, especially directed at women, you're so emotional.
Oh, yeah.
And again, on the surface,
Right.
it might sound like, oh, I'm just commenting on your, your personality or whatever, but it
Uh-huh.
really undermines
It undermines their,
their credibility,
professionalism.
professionalism. Exactly.
And it plays into those gender stereotypes, right?
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
And then, another one that comes up a lot is, people saying things like, I don't see color.
Oh, yeah?
And, they think they're being,
Woke.
yeah, like they're being, progressive or inclusive, but actually it kind of invalidates people's experiences.
Totally. Yeah.
Like race and ethnicity are a part of who we are. And,
Yeah, it's like erasing a part of their...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's also kind of ignoring the very real impact,
Right.
race has had
Right.
and continues to have in our society.
Yes, and it's like you can't just like wish it away.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
saying, I don't see color.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another one that, I've heard a lot is, directed at people's sexual orientation. So, like,
Oh, yeah.
oh, I can't believe you're dating someone like that. Yeah. It's just so dismissive.
Yeah. Or like,
Look at anything,
making assumptions about somebody's,
yes.
Relationship or
Yes.
like who they should be with or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly. And it kind of reinforces this idea that, their relationship is somehow less valid or, less worthy than heterosexual relationships.
Right. Those are the kinds of things that I think can really make people feel like they don't belong.
Absolutely. Like you're an outsider.
Yeah.
You're not. You're othered.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's really the insidious impact of these microaggressions, is that they make people feel like they don't belong.
Right. And over time, like we were talking about earlier, like that can have a real impact on somebody's
Absolutely.
mental health and well-being.
Absolutely. And their productivity too. If you're constantly feeling like you have to second guess yourself.
Right.
Or you're worried about saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Or you're, constantly being undermined.
Or you feel like you have to work twice as hard to prove yourself.
Absolutely. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it takes a toll.
Right.
And so the question is, now that we've kind of identified the problem,
yeah,
what can we do about it?
How do we start to address this and create a more, inclusive and positive work environment?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the first step is probably just becoming more aware.
Absolutely.
Of these things, right?
Yeah, because you can't fix a problem you can't see, right? So we have to be able to kind of spot these things before we can start to change them.
So what are some of the signs that we should be looking out for?
Well, we talked about the backhanded compliments.
Right.
Those compliments that feel more like insults. Oh, you're so articulate, or wow, you're so well spoken for someone from,
right.
Fill in the blank.
Yeah.
So those are some red flags, but also pay attention to the types of questions people ask.
Oh yeah.
Do they make someone feel othered?
Right.
Like, where are you really from?
Right. It's like questioning their belonging.
Exactly. Like, you don't really belong here, do you?
Right.
And then there's the dismissive language, like, I don't see color.
Right.
Which, as we talked about, it sounds well-intentioned.
Yeah.
But it actually kind of...
And validates people's experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then even just body language,
yeah.
Like if somebody is constantly, distancing themselves from someone or avoiding eye contact, that can be a sign that there's some discomfort.
Right. Or some bias there. Exactly. Yeah.
So there are all sorts of subtle cues that we can pick up on.
So let's say you're in a situation where you witness this happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the best way to respond in that moment?
That's a great question.
Like, do you just ignore it, or is there something you could do to intervene?
Well, I think that's where the role of the bystander becomes really important.
Okay.
We're not just passive observers. We can actually play a really active role in interrupting these behaviors and supporting those who are targeted.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, one of the most powerful things you can do is simply validate the victim's experience.
Okay.
Let them know that you saw what happened and that it wasn't okay.
Okay.
Something as simple as saying, hey, that comment didn't sit right with me either can go a long way.
So you're basically saying, like, I see you.
Yes.
I hear you.
Exactly.
And what you experienced was not okay.
Exactly. And it wasn't just you.
Yeah.
Other people noticed it too, and it wasn't okay.
And I'm on your side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be so powerful for someone who's been targeted, because often they feel very alone.
Right.
They feel like they're the only one who noticed it, or that, they're overreacting or whatever.
Like maybe I'm being too sensitive.
Right.
Yeah.
And so to have someone else acknowledge it and say, no, you know what? That wasn't okay.
Right.
That's really powerful.
It's almost like giving them permission.
Yes.
To feel.
To feel their feelings.
Yeah.
And to trust their gut.
Yeah.
Right. And to know that they're not alone.
Okay.
And that it's not okay.
Yeah, and that it's okay to speak up about it.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one way to intervene.
Okay. And we'll talk about some other ways to intervene in just a minute.
Absolutely.
But first, we're going to take a quick break.
Sounds good.
And we're back talking about microaggressions and how we can all work towards, creating a more inclusive and respectful workplace.
Yeah, and, we were just talking about the role of the bystander and how important it is to, speak up and validate the victim's experience.
Right.
But, sometimes it might feel awkward to directly confront the person who made the microaggression,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
especially if it's your boss
Yeah.
or someone in a position of authority.
Right. Like you don't want to jeopardize your job or,
Exactly.
create a hostile work environment or anything.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just not safe,
Right.
to confront someone directly.
Especially if dealing with somebody who's,
Right.
particularly volatile or.
Yeah, or if there's a power dynamic there.
Right.
So in those cases, it's perfectly valid to focus on supporting the victim,
Okay.
offer a listening ear,
Right.
check in on them privately.
Yeah.
Let them know that you're loyal for them.
Yeah. Just create that safe space.
Exactly. And sometimes that's all you can do.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
But, in other situations, you might feel more comfortable addressing the situation directly.
Right. Like if it's a coworker or,
Yeah.
somebody who you feel like you have
A rapport with.
yeah.
And in those cases, there are some things you can do to intervene effectively.
Like what are some strategies for that?
Well, one thing you can do is simply ask a clarifying question.
Okay.
Like, what did you mean by that?
Okay.
Or can you help me understand why you said that?
So you're not necessarily accusing them.
Right. It's not about attacking them. It's about
encouraging them to think about what they said.
Exactly. It's about creating a pause.
Right.
A moment of reflection.
Right.
And even if they don't have a good answer,
Yeah.
it sends a message that this type of language is not acceptable.
Right. Like we're not just going to let this slide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, even if you don't see immediate change, you've planted a seed.
Right.
You've disrupted the status quo.
Okay.
And you've made it clear that microaggressions won't be tolerated.
Yeah. You're kind of setting a boundary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Okay. So those are some strategies for bystanders.
Yeah.
But what about for those of us who are on the receiving end of these microaggressions?
That's a great question.
Like, how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah.
And advocate for our needs?
One of the most important things is to practice assertive communication,
Okay.
to calmly but firmly address the issue
Right.
with the person who made the comment.
So speaking up for yourself.
Exactly. Even if it feels difficult,
Right.
sometimes it's better to take some time to process your emotions
Yeah.
and then address the issue privately.
Right.
But it's important to speak up,
Yeah.
because if you don't say anything,
Right.
then the behavior is likely to continue.
And it also sends the message that it's okay.
Exactly.
Like you're condoning it.
And even if you don't feel comfortable confronting the person directly, you can always, document it.
Absolutely. Documentation is key,
Right.
especially if the behavior continues.
Yeah, like keeping a journal or something.
Exactly. A journal can be so helpful, both for processing your emotions
Right.
and for providing evidence
Right.
if you decide to report the behavior to HR or management.
Okay, so documentation,
Yes.
assertive communication.
Mhm.
But sometimes, even with all of that, the problem persists.
Right.
So what other resources are available for people who are facing,
Yeah.
ongoing microaggressions?
Well, thankfully, there are legal frameworks in place to protect employees from discrimination,
Okay.
including microaggressions.
So even though they're subtle,
Right.
they can still have legal consequences
Absolutely.
for companies.
Yes. Discrimination laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Provide a framework for addressing these subtle forms of bias.
So it's not just about doing the right thing.
Right.
It's also about complying with the law.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And failing to address these issues can not only lead to costly litigation,
Right.
but it can also damage a company's reputation.
Yeah, nobody wants to work for a company that's known for,
Exactly.
being discriminatory.
Right.
So there's a strong business case for creating a more inclusive workplace.
There is, and beyond the legal consideration,
Yeah.
there's a strong ethical imperative as well.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What are the ethical obligations for employers?
Well, ethically speaking, employers have a responsibility to create an environment that is free from bias and prejudice.
Okay.
This means going beyond simply complying with the law
Well,
and proactively fostering a culture of respect
All
where
right.
everyone feels valued and supported.
so it's about creating that sense of psychological safety
Absolutely.
where people feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to work
Yes,
without fear of being judged or marginalized.
exactly. And when companies actively address microaggressions,
Yeah.
They're demonstrating a commitment to social responsibility
Okay.
and a recognition that diversity and inclusion are essential for success.
So it's not just about being nice.
Right.
It's also about,
It's good for business.
yeah, it's good for business.
And it's the right thing to do.
And it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get practical.
Okay.
What are some tangible steps that organizations can take?
To create this more respectful and inclusive work environment, well, the first step is to establish clear policies that specifically address microaggressions.
Right.
This means defining what they are,
Right.
outlining the consequences for engaging in this behavior,
Okay.
and providing clear reporting mechanisms
Okay.
for those who experience or witness it.
So putting it in writing that this behavior won't be tolerated.
Exactly.
But it's not enough to just have a policy, right?
Right. You have to actually enforce it.
You have to enforce it, and you have to make sure that people know about it.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to provide comprehensive training to all employees,
Okay.
not just leadership.
Right.
This training should go beyond simply defining microaggressions.
Right.
It should equip employees with the skills to recognize them,
Okay.
interrupt them,
Yeah.
and support those who are targeted.
So giving people the tools and the confidence to actually intervene.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then, beyond training and policies,
Yeah.
it's also important to create a culture of open dialogue
Okay.
where employees feel safe to share their experiences and challenge the status quo.
So fostering that sense of psychological safety
Exactly.
where people feel comfortable speaking up,
Yeah.
even if it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. And this requires a commitment from leadership.
Okay.
Leaders need to be role models for inclusive behavior,
Right.
actively championing diversity initiatives,
Yeah.
and holding themselves and others accountable
Yeah.
for creating a more equitable workplace.
So it's about setting the tone from the top
Exactly.
and creating a culture where everyone feels valued and respected.
Precisely. And it's an ongoing process.
Right.
It's not something you achieve overnight.
Yeah.
It takes time, effort, and a willingness to continuously learn and adapt.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground,
It has.
from recognizing microaggressions to implementing organizational strategies for addressing them.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, change starts with each of us.
Yes.
How do we become more aware of our own biases
Mhm.
and prevent ourselves from unintentionally perpetuating
Yeah.
these harmful behaviors?
That's the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, that is the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? Because we've been talking about, how to recognize it in others,
Right.
but how do we turn that spotlight inward
Mm-hmm.
and really examine, our own biases?
Yeah, it's not easy.
No.
It's not comfortable.
No, it's like holding up a mirror to yourself
Right.
and really taking a hard look.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are afraid to do that.
Yeah, because they're afraid of what they might find.
Yeah, and there's this fear of being labeled as, racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever.
Right.
But the reality is that we all have biases.
Yeah.
It's part of being human.
It's part of how our brains are wired.
Exactly. Our brains are designed to make quick judgments based on our experiences and the messages we've received throughout our lives.
Right. It's like those mental shortcuts
Yeah.
that our brains create to
Exactly.
process information quickly.
Exactly.
But sometimes those shortcuts lead to biased thinking.
Absolutely. And those biases can influence our words and actions even when we don't intend to cause harm.
So it's not always about being a bad person.
Right.
It's about understanding that we all have these blind spots. We
Yeah.
all have these, these biases that we're carrying around with us.
Yeah. And so it's about being aware of them
Right.
and trying to challenge them.
So where do we even begin with that?
Well, I think the first step is just acknowledging that we all have them.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's not about feeling guilty or ashamed. It's about understanding that it's a normal part of the human experience.
Okay.
And then once we've acknowledged that, we can start to pay attention to our thoughts and feelings.
Right.
When we meet someone new,
Yeah.
what are our initial reactions?
Right.
What are the assumptions we're making about them?
Yeah, what pops into your head first?
Exactly. And where are those assumptions coming from?
Right.
Are they based on facts or are they based on stereotypes?
So if you catch yourself making an assumption about somebody
Mm-hmm.
based on, their appearance or their background,
Yeah.
that's kind of a clue that there might be some unconscious bias at play.
Exactly. It's like a little red flag saying, hey, pay attention to this thought.
Right. It's like,
Where is this coming from?
yeah.
Is it based on facts or is it based on something else?
Yeah. Or is it based on, something you saw on TV or,
Right, exactly.
something you heard from somebody else
Yeah.
that's not actually based in reality?
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's about questioning those assumptions
Right.
and challenging them.
Okay. So let's say we've done that.
Yeah.
We've identified, some of those biases.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step? How do we actually unlearn them?
Well, unlearning biases is an ongoing process.
Okay.
It's not a one-time fix.
Right.
But one of the most effective strategies is to expose ourselves to diverse perspectives and experiences.
So like reading books by authors from different backgrounds,
Yes.
watching movies and TV shows that feature diverse characters,
Absolutely.
listening to podcasts with diverse voices, like this one.
Exactly. But, also engaging in conversations with people who have different life experiences than our own.
So it's about like actively seeking out
Yeah.
those different perspectives
Exactly.
rather than just kind of staying in our own little bubble.
Yes. Get out of your comfort zone. Challenge yourself to see the world through different lenses.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things about diversity is that it really enriches our lives.
It does.
It makes us more well-rounded individuals.
Absolutely.
It makes us more empathetic,
Yeah.
and it helps us to understand the world in a more nuanced way.
And, the more we expose ourselves to diversity, the more we realize that our own limited perspectives are just that limited.
Yeah.
There's so much more to the world than what we've experienced.
And I think that's a really important message for everyone to hear
Yeah,
because we all have something to learn from each other.
absolutely.
And the more we can open ourselves up to those different perspectives, the better off we'll all be.
I completely agree.
Well, this has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
We've covered so much ground,
Yeah.
from recognizing microaggressions to reflecting on our own biases to creating more inclusive workplaces.
Absolutely.
And I think the key takeaway here is that we all have a role to play
Yes.
in creating a more just and equitable world.
100%.
And it starts with each of us.
Yeah.
Being willing to examine our own biases, to speak up when we see something that's not right,
Yes.
and to create space for those who have been marginalized.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has empowered you to be more aware, more mindful,
Yeah.
and more proactive in creating a more inclusive world.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this journey,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
and keep those conversations going.